Chapter 7 of Half Past Bedtime by H. Bashford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Imaginary Boy. Soon after Doris's adventure with the flute, Marian and Gwendolen made a most solemn vow. Marian pricked her finger with a needle and made a tiny drop of blood come, and then she rubbed it into the palm of Gwendolen's hand, and promised to be faithful to her forever. Then Gwendolen pricked her own finger and rubbed it into the palm of Marian's hand, and took her dying oath that Marian should always be her greatest friend. Then they washed their hands under the nursery tap, and cleaned the needle and put it back in the workbox, and Marian was very pleased, and so was Gwendolen, and when they told Cuthbert, he said that he didn't mind much. Marian was pleased because she knew that Gwendolen would ask her to tea pretty often at the old farmhouse, and Gwendolen was pleased because that was the first time that she had ever had a greatest friend. And Cuthbert didn't mind much because he had gone to a new school where there was a boy called Edward Goldsmith, who was wonderfully strong and could dive into the water backward from the top diving board at the town baths. He was going to be a barrister like Mr Jenkins, who took the plate round at St Peter's Church, and after that he was going to be Lord Chief Justice, like the great Lord Barrington at Fairbarrow Park. Gwendolen's aunt was pleased too, and so was Captain Jeremy, when Gwendolen told him, and so were her father and mother, who were climbing the Himalaya mountains and writing a book called Two Above the Snow Line. But Gwendolen didn't know, of course, about her father and mother being glad till she got a letter from them, and by then she had become quite used to having Marian for her greatest friend. This letter came during the first week of the holidays, while Marian was staying for a few days with Gwendolen. Both Gwendolen's aunt and Captain Jeremy were away on a short voyage, and Marian and Gwendolen had the house to themselves, except for Mrs Robertson the cook, Amy and Agnes the two maids, and Percy the boot and garden boy. Percy was the boy that used to open the door when Gwendolen's aunt lived in Bellington Square, and his father was a gamekeeper called Mr Williams, who worked for Lord Barrington at Fairbarrow Park. Percy was 16 and was going to marry Agnes as soon as he had saved enough money, and though he was rather proud, Marian and Gwendolen liked him, but not so much as they liked his father. They liked Mr Williams because he knew all about rabbits, and used to take them through places marked private, and they liked Mrs Williams because she gave them peppermints and never minded how many questions they asked. Mr Williams was tall, with a grey moustache, and his clothes smelt of tobacco, and he wore garters. And Mrs Williams was short, and her arms smelt of soap, and she was always popping upstairs to change her apron. They lived in a little cottage near the park gates, and they had 6 children besides Percy, but Mr Williams was nearly always out, setting traps or counting the young partridges. Fairbarrow Park was about 3 miles round, and was halfway to Fairbarrow Down, and in the middle of it was Lord Barrington's house, with its 30 bedrooms and all its gardens. There was an Italian garden, and a Dutch garden, and a rose garden, and a water garden, and there were lawns as smooth as a ballroom floor, over which the peacocks cried and strutted. But besides all these, and the park in which they nestled, most of the country round belonged to Lord Barrington, and it was in the woods and fields which he let to different farmers that the pheasants and partridges made their homes. When they had finished reading Gwendolen's letter, which came just after their middle-day dinner, Marian and Gwendolen thought that they would go and see Mr Williams, and watch the young partridges that he was bringing up by hand. So they set off, and presently they found him just at the farther edge of Lord Barrington's estate, where there was a little wood climbing up the side of Fairbarrow Down. There was a sort of grassy hollow near the wood, and here Mr Williams had placed half a dozen hen coops, and in front of these he had built a little mound made of lumps of turf dug from the down. In among these lumps of turf there were thousands of ants, and several ants' nests full of eggs, and a score of young partridges were scrambling over them, finding their afternoon meal. Usually Mr. Williams was glad to see the girls and let them play with the young partridges, but this afternoon he only nodded to them and went on smoking in silence. They were a little surprised, because it was such a lovely afternoon, with the sky bluer than any ocean, and the fields all glittering with the leaves of the root crops, or hidden away under the golden wheat. Here and there the reapers were already at work cutting the first of the oats and barley, and about a mile away they could see the chimneys of the great house shining in groups between the tree-tops. The only dark spot was the thick and tangled pine-wood, known as the Haunted Wood, into which Lord Barrington never allowed anybody beside himself to go. It was inside the park, and round two sides of it ran the park wall, with sharp iron spikes at the top, and round the other two sides there was a barbed-wire fence, with a small gate in it, heavily padlocked. For 20 years it had never been touched. When a tree fell over, it lay where it had fallen. Between the trunks of the other trees there had grown a jungle of undergrowth, and only Lord Barrington had the key to the gate. Mr. Williams was still sitting down, staring moodily in front of him, when Marian asked him what was the matter, and was he angry with them for coming? "No, no, it's not that," he said. "But I've just got the push. His lordship has given me a month's notice. I've got to quit and find a new job, after 42 years here, man and boy." Marian and Gwendolen stared at him in astonishment. "Why, whatever have you been doing?" Gwendolen asked. He took his pipe from his mouth and pointed at the Haunted Wood. "See that wood there?" he said. "The Haunted Wood? Well, last night one of these here dogs, he bolted into it, and I couldn't get him out. So I went in to hunt for him. I was only in there for 5 minutes, but just as I was coming out I met his lordship. He stared at me as if I was a criminal in the dock, and gave me a month's notice to leave his service. 'You know my rules,' he said, 'and you've broken them. It's no good arguing,' he says. 'You've got to go.'" Marian and Gwendolen felt very angry, angrier than they had ever felt before. "What a beast!" they said. "But perhaps he'll think better of it." Mr. Williams shook his head. "Not he," he said. "I've seen him this morning. 'I'll give you a pension,' he says, 'and I'll give you a good character. But that wood's forbidden ground,' he says, 'and I'll have nobody going into it.'" Mr. Williams rose and began to collect the young partridges and put them away into the various hen coops. "Well, I must be getting along," he said, "and next month you'll have to make friends with the new keeper." After he was gone, Marian and Gwendolen sat thinking of all the good times that they had had with him, and of poor Mrs. Williams, who would have to turn out of her cottage, the gay little cottage that she was so proud of. Their cheeks were quite red, and there was a hot sort of prickly feeling at the backs of their noses, and they felt as if they would like to go to the great house and shoot Lord Barrington dead. "Dog in the manger," said Gwendolen. "That's what he is, with that great big house and no wife or children, and he's always going into his old wood himself. I know he is, because Percy told me." "Yes, I know," said Marian, "and half his time he never lives at the park at all. He's judging people and sending them to prison, or traveling about and enjoying himself." "Perhaps he doesn't know," said Gwendolen, "what a nice man Mr. Williams really is." Then she suddenly thought of something. "Suppose we go and find him," she said, "and ask him to let Mr. Williams off." Marian was a little frightened. She had never seen Lord Barrington, but she had once seen his picture in a magazine, and she remembered the grim look in his eyes, and his high-bridged, hawk-like nose. But the thought of Mr. Williams and his sad face soon gave her fresh courage, and as soon as they drew near the park wall she was much too excited to feel afraid. Gwendolen was excited too, but they both knew how important it was to keep cool, and before they climbed the wall they looked carefully round to see that nobody was watching them. Then they found a couple of niches to put their toes in, and they hoisted themselves up till they could see over the wall, and there they stopped for a moment, holding on to the spikes and studying the lie of the land. Just to their right was the corner of the haunted wood, but spreading in front of them was the open park land, with its great trees casting their blue shadows, and the delicate-limbed deer nibbling the grass tips. Beyond these were the gardens, and the broad terrace in front of the house, and the only person in sight was a distant gardener with a watering-can. Then they almost fell down, for round the corner of the wood came the tall figure of Lord Barrington himself. Marian recognized him at once, though he was not wearing a wig, as he had been in the magazine picture, and was dressed in a gray flannel suit, carefully pressed, and russet brown boots. Luckily he didn't see them, and they crouched behind the wall, holding on to the edge with their finger-tips, and when they next peeped over they could see him unlocking the padlock of the little gate that led into the wood. He went inside and locked it again behind him, and they saw him begin to push his way through the branches of the trees. "Come along," whispered Gwendolen. "Let's follow him." So they climbed over the wall and dropped into the park. Then they ran across the grass to the little gate, where they stooped down for a moment and listened. They could hear Lord Barrington still moving through the wood, and then, very quietly, they squeezed through the fence. They both tore their frocks on the barbed wire, and Marian scratched her arm, but she didn't mind. And then they began to glide as softly as possible, deeper and deeper into the forbidden wood. Soon it was so dark, owing to the thick spreading branches and the overgrown weeds and bushes, that they found themselves creeping through a sort of twilight, smelling of pine resin and crushed herbage. But always, just in front of them, they could hear Lord Barrington's footsteps, and sometimes they caught a glimpse of his side or back. Tripping over roots and stung by nettles, they followed in the track that he had beaten down, and presently the brushwood began to grow thinner, and the trunks of the trees farther apart. He was walking more quickly now, and in another 3 or 4 minutes they saw him come out into a sort of clearing, where the ground was smooth, with a thin growth of grass, and the sun pouring down upon it as upon a little circus. Here he stopped, and they bent down, each behind the trunk of a great pine tree, and then, to their surprise, they saw him take his coat off, and fold it carefully and put it on the ground. Then from under a bush he drew out 3 wickets, and set them up on the other side of the clearing, and put the bales on them, and laid down a bat beside them, and came back tossing a cricket ball. They could see his face, still rather stern-looking, but not so stern as it had been before, and then they heard him say, "Ready?" and saw him bowl the ball, which bounced over the wickets and hit a tree behind. They crept nearer until they were almost on the edge of the clearing. "You ought to have stopped that one," they heard him say, and still the bat lay in front of the wickets, and there wasn't a sound but the murmur of the trees. For a long time, almost 10 minutes, they thought, he went on bowling and fetching back the ball, and every now and then he spoke a few words, as if there were somebody really batting. And then a strange thing happened, for slowly, as they watched, they saw the bat rise from the ground, and then they saw the figure of a little boy taking guard with it in front of the wickets. He was about 14, with short fair hair, and he was dressed in a flannel shirt and trousers, and the shirt was unbuttoned, showing the upper part of his chest, and its sleeves were rolled back over his sturdy arms. They looked at the judge, and saw that his whole face had altered, as if the sun had come down and were shining through it, and the boy smiled at him, and then tucked his lips in as the judge bowled him a difficult ball. "Well played," said the judge, and they saw the boy look up and begin to color a little at the words of praise. And then Gwendolen got a cramp in her foot, and couldn't help moving and making a sound. Lord Barrington turned sharply toward her. "Who's there?" he asked in a terrible voice. Gwendolen stood up, and so did Marian. It was no good hiding. They were both too frightened to speak. When he saw them He stood quite still. A wood pigeon flew across the clearing. The little boy was no longer there. "Come here," he said, and they had to obey him. He stood looking at them. His face was like marble, and his eyes searched them through and through. "Well," he said, "what have you got to say for yourselves?" They hung their heads and said nothing. Then Marian tried to speak, though her voice sounded funny. "Please, sir," she said, "we wanted to ask you something, but you were playing with the boy." "The boy?" he said. "Did you see the boy?" They lifted their eyes to him. "Why, of course," they answered. For a moment he was silent. Then his voice changed a little. "Come and sit down," he said, "and tell me what you saw." When they told him, he just nodded and sat, as Mr. Williams had done, staring in front of him. "Well, now you know," he said, "why this wood is private, and why I never allow anybody to come into it." "Because of the boy?" asked Marian. "Because of the boy," he said. "I'll try to explain it to you, but I doubt if you'll understand. You see, I had a notion that if we human beings could only imagine anything hard enough, the thing that we imagined might become actually real, if only just for a minute or two." He moved his hand with its heavy gold signet ring. "This is the place," he said, "where I come to imagine." "I see," said Marian. "But why do you imagine the boy?" He reached for his coat and took something out of a pocketbook. "This is his photograph," he said. "He was my only son." The two children looked at it, and they gave it back to him. "He was fond of cricket," he said. "He died at school." Then he rose to his feet, and they followed him out of the wood. "Well, what was it," he said, "that you wanted to ask me?" They told him, and his face became stern again. "But he knew the rule," he said, "and he was older than you, and rules are made to be kept, you know. I can't have them broken." They were silent for a moment, and then Gwendolen had an awful and rather irreverent idea. "But perhaps if God hadn't broken one of His rules," she said, "you might never have seen the boy." He stood looking at her for a long time, or at least it seemed long, though it was only 12 seconds. Then he glanced at his watch. "What are your names?" he asked. They told him their names, and he held out his hand. "Well, goodbye, Marian and Gwendolen," he said, "and you can tell Mr. Williams that I've changed my mind." Deep within the wood I know There's a place where mourners go, Just as in the twilight cool Crept they to Siloam's pool. There with one accord they bring Sorrows for a healing wing, And each hushed and stooping leaf Lays its hand on their heart's grief. End of chapter 7. Of Half Past Bedtime by H. Bashford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The Hill That Remembered. Cuthbert's friend, Edgar Goldsmith, was 6 months older than Cuthbert, but they were in the same form, which was the lowest but one, in Mr. Pendring's school. Most of the other boys thought him conceited, and so did Cuthbert, and so he was. But Cuthbert had once been conceited himself, and so he was able to sympathize with him. Besides being strong, too, and able to dive backward, Edward had given Cuthbert his second best pocket-knife, and that was why Cuthbert resolved at last to introduce him to Tod the Gipsy. That was a rather special thing to do, because Tod was rather a special sort of gipsy, and Cuthbert had never introduced him to anybody, not even to Doris, although she had asked him to. It was in the hospital, just before he had had his tonsils out, that Cuthbert had first met Tod, and Tod had told him not to be frightened, because there was no need to be, and it wouldn't do any good. Tod himself was often in hospital because he had consumption, and had lost one of his lungs, and besides that he was always getting knocked down or run over, through being absent-minded. He was tall and thin, with a lot of black hair that kept tumbling over his eyes, and his eyes were brown, like a dog's eyes, only they were brighter and always laughing. When Cuthbert next met Tod he had been living in his little tent on the other side of Fairbarrow Down, and Cuthbert had stayed there all night with him, and Tod had told him the names of the stars. Very early in the morning, when Cuthbert woke up, he had seen Tod kneeling in the dew, and a couple of wild rabbits nestling in his arms and smelling his clothes, just as if they had been tame ones. Then Tod had beckoned him with his head and whistled a peculiar sweet whistle, and a hare near by had picked up her ears and come through the grass to have her back stroked. That whistle was one of Tod's secrets, and he knew lots more, and was always learning new ones, and when Cuthbert had told him about In-between Land, he said that he had been there too, by another way. So it was rather a great thing for Cuthbert to promise Edward that he would introduce him to Tod the Gipsy, and Edward was naturally rather impatient to go and find him and talk to him. But the difficulty was that Tod was always traveling about, and Cuthbert never knew where he was likely to be, and it wasn't until tea-time on the 3rd Monday of October that at last they found him, quite by accident. Owing to one of Mr. Pendring's boys having won a medal for helping to save somebody's life, the whole school had been given an extra half-holiday, and Cuthbert and Edward had gone for a country walk. Already in the town most of the leaves had fallen and were lying in dirty heaps by the roadside, and the scraps of gardens in front of the houses were sodden and empty of flowers. But out in the country where the harvest was stacked, men were drilling seed into the moist-smelling earth. The oaks and elms were still glowing with coppery or rusty red leaves. The cottage gardens, too, were full of flowers, clumps of starry Michaelmas daisies, and sheaves of dark-eyed golden sunflowers, like bumblebees on fire. But there were real fires about also, as there always are when summer is over. Fires of weeds at the ends of the plow furrows, and fires of potato stems in the kitchen gardens, and it was over a little fire of sticks and dead leaves that they suddenly came upon Tod the Gipsy. They were now about 6 miles from home, at the foot of the long range of hills, of which Fairbarrow Down, with its close-cropped turf, was the nearest to the town. Behind this the ground dipped a little, and then became a hill called Simon's Knob, and behind Simon's Knob rose the highest hill of all, known as Caesar's Camp. From Caesar's Camp on a very clear day it was just possible to see the sea, and battles had been fought on all these hills hundreds and thousands of years before. Sometimes they had been held by the ancient Britons when they were fighting against each other, and sometimes they had been held by the ancient Britons when they were fighting against the Romans. Sometimes the Romans had held them when they were attacked by the Britons, and once the Britons had held them against the Saxons, and then in their turn the Saxons had held them when they were being attacked by the Danes. After that they had slept for hundreds of years, with only the sheep to nibble their grass, and an occasional shepherd shouting across them to his shaggy and wise-eyed sheep-dog. The fiercest battle of all had been fought on Caesar's Camp, from which the Romans had driven away the Britons, and there was a great mound on it, covered with grass, in which the dead soldiers had been buried. But that was nearly 2,000 years ago, and it had never looked more peaceful than on this autumn afternoon, with the baby moon peering above it, and growing brighter as the daylight faded. It was a steep climb to the top of Caesar's Camp, and the hill was guarded at the bottom by a fringe of elm trees, and in front of these elm trees there was a belt of bracken, reddened with decay and reaching to the boys' shoulders. It had been rather fun to push their way through it, startling the rabbits and listening to the rooks, and it was in a little quarry among the elms that Tod the Gipsy had made his fire. Close to the fire he had spread some branches and a heap of bracken to make a mattress, and over this he had thrown his blanket and the little tarpaulin that made his tent. When they first caught sight of him, he was humming a song and beating an accompaniment to himself on an empty biscuit box. Where do the gypsies come from? The gypsies come from Egypt. The fiery sun begot them. Their dam was the desert dry. She lay there stripped and basking, and gave them suck for the asking, and an emperor's bone to play with whenever she heard them cry. Cuthbert introduced him to Edward Goldsmith, and Tod held out a bony hand. "Glad to meet you," he said. "You're just in time for tea. You'll have to share a mug, but there's lots of bread and jam." He was thinner than ever, but he had the same old trick of tossing his hair back from his eyes, and his eyes were as bright and gay and piercing as if they had just come back from some magic wash. While they were eating, he sipped his tea and filled his pipe and went on singing. What did the gypsies do there? They built a tomb for Pharaoh. They built a tomb for Pharaoh, so tall it touched the sky. They buried him deep inside it, then let what would betide it. They saddled their lean-ribbed ponies and left him there to die. He nodded his head toward the sides of the quarry, the overhanging trees and the hill beyond. "And this is where they've left me," he said. Cuthbert stared at him. "But you're not going to die, are you?" "Pretty soon," said Tod. He tapped his chest. "There's not much left, you know, in this old box of mine." "Well, you don't seem to mind much," said Edward. "I don't," said Tod, "and I'll tell you why. I've just found out something that I've been looking for very nearly all my life." He lit his pipe and leaned forward, with the fire shining in his eyes. The days were so short now that the dusk had already come, and the firelight cast strange shadows over the little quarry. The boys drew closer to him, and he took from his waistcoat pocket a small box with a pinch of red powder in it. "For 20 years," he said, "I've been trying to make this powder, and at last I've succeeded. Just in time." They bent over his hand and examined the powder. It was light as thistledown and smelt like cloves. "Now look." He threw some on the fire, but the boys could see nothing except the crumbling leaves. Tod laughed. "Look a little higher," he said, and then in the smoke they suddenly saw a bird hovering, and then another bird and another, and a couple of nests hanging faintly in the air. "Now listen," said Tod, and above the whisper of the flames they could hear the soft sharpening of tiny beaks, and the sound of wings, and the ghosts of cheepings and chirpings, as if they had been hundreds of miles away. Then they faded, and Tod leaned back, looking triumphantly at the two boys. "But what were they?" said Cuthbert. "They were memories," said Tod. "They were the memories of those dead leaves." "But do leaves remember?" asked Edward. "Everything remembers," said Tod. "Only nobody's been able to prove it. The ground we're sitting on, the fields you've come across, the hills above us, they're crammed with memories. And when they die, if they ever do die, these memories come crowding back to them, just like they do to a dying man, and it's this powder that makes them visible." He rose to his feet and looked about him. "Of course, those leaves," he said, "were only a year old, and all that they remembered were just those birds. But look at this." He picked up a piece of wood. "This is the core of an old tree. This was a sapling 300 years ago." He sprinkled the rest of the powder on it and threw it into the fire. For a minute or two nothing happened, and then high up they saw some more birds hovering, but presently as they looked they saw the figure of a man, with his hair in ringlets hanging down over his shoulders. He wore a plumed hat, and his sleeves were frilled, and there was a sword at his belt, and he wore knee breeches and stockings and jeweled buckles upon his shoes. He stood in mid-air, looking about him, and then he was joined by a figure of a girl. He took her in his arms, and then they faded away, and there instead was a peasant in a smock. They saw him lean forward and carve something in the air, as though he were cutting somebody's name upon a tree trunk, and then he too was gone. And there were two children playing hide and seek in the wreathing smoke. One was a little girl, and she wore a mob cap and a long skirt drooping almost to her ankles, and the other was a boy with a very short jacket and trousers that looked as if they had shrunk. Then they saw a fox with his ears pricked, and one of his front paws lifted, and then there was nothing again but the sides of the quarry and the deepening shadows of the elms. "That's all," said Todd, "because I've no more powder. All the rest's up there." He jerked his thumb toward the top of the hill, hidden away from them by the trees. "Why is it up there?" asked Cuthbert. Todd stared at them as if he were trying to read their hearts. "Have you courage?" he asked. It was a difficult question. They told him that they hoped so, but that they weren't quite sure. "Well, if you have," he said, "and you'd like to come back here tonight, just about 12:30, you'll be able to see something that nobody alive has ever seen or will see again." Cuthbert and Edward looked at one another. It would be a 6-mile walk, and they would have to start about 11 o'clock, and they would have to go to bed first and creep out of their houses without anybody knowing. The moon would have sunk, too, so that it would be quite dark. They both felt a little queer inside, but they promised to come, and agreed to meet at 11 o'clock near St. Peter's Church. Cuthbert was there first, just before the clock struck. Everybody was in bed, and he had slipped out unnoticed. But his heart sank a little as he ran down the empty street and saw no Edward at the corner waiting for him. But Edward came just as the clock struck, and the night seemed less dark now that there were two of them, and soon they were out of the town, running close together between the hedges of the country road. Once a motor car came traveling toward them, almost blinding them with the glare of its headlamps, but after they had left the road and struck across the fields the night was so still that they could almost have heard a star drop. It was so still that they spoke in whispers, and so dark that they sometimes tripped, and once, when they stopped for a moment to take breath, a star did drop, and they almost heard it. Presently, when their eyes became used to the darkness, they could see the dim outline of the hills and the faint ribbon of the Milky Way rising like smoke from Caesar's camp. At the edge of the bracken they found Todd waiting for them. "Come along," he said, "only don't go too fast." And they began to climb through the belt of trees out onto the hillside beyond. The grass was short here and slippery with dew, with glimmers of chalk beneath it where the turf was broken, and it was so steep that halfway up Todd stopped to fight for his breath. "It's all right," he said. "I'll be better in a moment." And as they stood waiting for him and looking back, the country behind them seemed to have vanished into a lake of darkness. Then they began to climb again, their boots slipping, and suddenly, as they climbed, they smelt a new smell, a strange sort of acrid, sweet smell, as of turf fires burning above them. "Yes," said Todd, "I was up there an hour ago. I've lit half a dozen fires." At the top of the hill he dropped down for a moment close to a large white stone. He lit a match and looked at his watch. 10 minutes to 1, he said. "We're just in time." They were now in a sort of trench or grassy moat that encircled the great mound, and they had climbed into this over a smaller mound that had once been a barricade. In this trench Todd had dug half a dozen holes, and in each of these holes there was a turf fire smoldering, and now he turned and lifted the white stone and took from under it a little bag. "This is the rest of the powder," he said, "all there is, and all there ever will be, for the secret will die with me." He rose to his feet and began to sprinkle it thickly over the burning turf in each of the little holes. Then he came back and spoke to the two boys. "There are great memories," he said, "stored in this hill, but they are fierce ones, and you'll need all your courage." Then he moved away from them toward the farthest of the fires, and Cuthbert felt a sort of change coming over the hill. He could see nothing, but it felt different, as if it were surrounded by a different sort of country, a savage country with no railways in it, or roads, or parliaments, or policemen. Even the stars seemed to have grown younger and nearer the earth, and more lawless. And then he heard voices filling the air about him, and a man shouting hoarse commands. He turned with a start, and found himself among a crowd of naked and half-naked men, small men with hair hanging over their shoulders, and bearded chins and glittering eyes. Some of them were painted with curious patterns, shining in dull colors from their skins, and they were all pointing toward the darkness that lay like a sea round the sides of the hill. Then some of them spoke to him and asked him who he was, and he found that he could understand them and could answer them. And the man who had been shouting, and who seemed to be their leader, came and looked into his eyes. He laid his hands on Cuthbert's shoulders. "Son of my sons," he said, "are you ready to fight with us?" And Cuthbert suddenly felt himself burning with anger, because he knew that they were going to be attacked. "Of course I am," he said, and then there was a great shout, and everybody rushed to the barricade, and there, all round them, pricking out of the darkness, they could see helmets and the rims of shields. Cuthbert somehow knew that these belonged to the Romans, and that he hated them for invading his country, and he was so excited that he had forgotten to notice what had happened to Edward Goldsmith. He only knew that he had disappeared. As for Edward, he had forgotten all about Cuthbert, for he had suddenly noticed that there were now trees growing halfway up the hillside, and he had jumped over the barricade and run down to explore them. When he got there, he had found himself among an army of men marching up the hill behind locked shields, and a young centurion with merry eyes had stooped and gripped him by the arm. "Hello," he said, "son of my sons, are you going to fight with us against these barbarians?" And Edward tingled all over with pride, and said, "Rather you bet I am." Then a great stone from the top of the barricade came leaping down the hillside and crushed one of the men in the front rank, but the others closed together and never stopped marching. When Cuthbert saw them he was blind with anger, and he knew in his heart that they were bound to win, and next moment they were over the parapet like a wave of hot and breathing iron. He heard groans and cries and the shouts of the British chief, and his eyes were full of tears as he beat at the Roman shields. And then he saw Edward, and hit him in the face, and made his nose bleed, and knocked out 2 of his teeth. Edward struck back and gave Cuthbert a black eye, and the night was full of hewings and the flashings of swords. And then everything was still again, and the hill was empty, and the stars were the same stars that they had always known. Squatting on the barricade, with his arms round his knees, they saw Tod the gypsy laughing at them, and Cuthbert rubbed his eye, and Edward sniffed hard to try and stop the blood running from his nose. Tod rose and stretched himself. "Well, you've had it out," he said, "and so has the hill, and now you'd better be off home." So they said good-bye to him, and they never saw him again. And next morning, when Edward came down to breakfast, his father scolded him for explaining that an ancient Briton had hit him on the nose. But Cuthbert's daddy only stroked his chin when he heard that the Romans had given Cuthbert a black eye, because that was just the sort of thing, he said, that the Romans sometimes did, though they had many good qualities. Down the dead centurion's way Tod the gypsy drives his shay. Roman, Briton, Saxon, Dane, Tod the gypsy hears them plain. Faint beneath the noonday chalk, Tod can overhear them talk. Fiercer than the stars at night, chin to chin he sees them fight. End of chapter 8. Of Half Past Bedtime by H. Bashford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. St. Uncus. It was now November, and even in the country the last of the leaves had fallen from the trees, and the bushy hollows between the roots of the downs were gray with Old Man's beard. Some people like November because it is the quietest month of the year, as quiet as somebody tired who has just fallen asleep, and they love to see the fields lying dark and still, and the empty branches against the sky. But some people hate it, especially people who live in towns, because of its fogs and falling rains, and they turn up their coat collars and blow their noses and call it the worst month of the year. Doris hated it too, and she hated this particular November more than any other that she could recall, because it had rained and rained and rained, and because her mummy was so ill that she had had to go to hospital. She was also angry with Cuthbert because she thought it wasn't fair for him to have taken Edward to see Tod the Gypsy and never even have offered to take her, although she had asked him over and over again. She hadn't spoken to him for nearly a month, not even after her mummy had been taken to the hospital, and she hated Auntie Kate, who had come to look after the house, because she kept asking her how her little boyfriend was. Auntie Kate had a face like a hen's, with a beaky nose and bobbly eyes, and she always counted people's pieces of bread and butter and wondered what income their father and mother had. Her husband was a clergyman, so she went to church a lot, on weekdays as well as on Sundays, and now she had gone to a bazaar at St. Peter's Church just when Doris had meant to go to tea with Gwendolen. So Doris was very angry, because she had to stay at home and take care of her 5 brothers, and the only happy thing that she had to think about was that Mummy would be home next week. But at 3:30 on a wet Saturday afternoon, next week seems a horribly long way off, and Jimmy and Jocko were being as naughty as ever they knew how. Jimmy was 6 and Jocko was 5, and they were playing water games in the bathroom, and Doris knew that they would be soaking their clothes and making an awful mess, but she didn't care. At any rate, they're quiet, she thought to herself, and I don't see why I should fight with them any more. Then she pressed her nose against the front door glass and looked dismally into the street. But there was nothing to see except the falling rain, and the dirty brown fronts of the opposite houses, and a strip of mud-colored sky, and the milkman's cart with its yellow pony. Behind her, in a dark cupboard under the stairs, Teddy and George, the twins, were playing at hell, and every now and then she could hear a faint clicking sound as they practiced gnashing their teeth. As for Christopher Mark, who was 3 1/2, she had forgotten all about him, and by now, if it hadn't been for Auntie Kate, she might have been playing in Gwendolen's big barn. Then she thought of Cuthbert again, and of his exciting adventure on the top of Caesar's Camp, and she breathed on the glass and drew a picture of Cuthbert, making him as ugly as she could. I hate him, she thought, and I hate Auntie Kate, and I hate the twins, and I hate everybody. And then she turned round, and her heart stood still, or at least she felt as if it did, and her cheeks became white, for there was Christopher Mark at the top of the stairs, with a rabbit under one arm and an engine under the other, and she suddenly saw him slip and begin to pitch headlong down with a sickening thud, thud, thud. For a moment she was so frightened that she could hardly breathe, but just as she sprang forward, an odd thing happened, for he stopped short, almost as if somebody had caught him, and didn't even begin to cry. "My goodness!" she said, and then she stopped short too, for squatting down on the topmost stair was the strangest little man that she had ever seen, hanging on to Christopher Mark. He was a little man with a bald head and a big mouth and a crooked back, and his right arm was only a stump, with a very long hook at the end of it. His left arm was odd too, almost as crooked as his back, and he had it curled round one of the banisters, while he hooked Christopher Mark up with the other. "Good afternoon," he said. "I see you have recognized me. That's very clever of you. Most people don't." Doris was too surprised at first to be able to answer him, but he didn't seem to mind, and went on smiling, while as for Christopher Mark, he climbed upstairs again, just as if the little man hadn't been there. "I'm afraid I don't recognize you," said Doris at last, "but I'm frightfully obliged to you for saving Christopher Mark." "Not at all," he said. "That's what I'm for. I'm St. Uncus." Doris frowned a little. "St. Uncus?" she asked. "Latin for hook," he said. "Excuse me half a moment." For a flicker of an eyelid he disappeared. "Just been to China," he said, "to hook another one." Doris opened her eyes. "But are you a real saint?" she asked. The little man flushed. "Why, of course I am. I'm a patron saint. I'm the patron saint of staircases." "But I didn't know," said Doris, "that staircases had patron saints." "They don't," he said. "They have only one." "I mean," said Doris, "it's frightfully rude, I'm afraid, but I didn't know they had even one." He smiled again. "Very likely not," he said. "Lots of people don't, but they have." He disappeared once more. "Baby in Jamaica," he said, "just beginning to fall from the top landing." Then he stroked his chin and looked at her thoughtfully. "I suppose you've been left here," he said, "to look after the children?" Doris nodded. "Well, then, you ought to know," he said, "that there are two things that children love more than anything else. One of them's water and the other's staircases, and they're both a bit dangerous. So they each have a patron saint." "I see," said Doris. "But who's the patron saint of water?" "Fellow called Fat Bill," he said. "He's my younger brother." "That seems a queer name," said Doris, "for a saint." "Well, he's a queer fellow," said St. Uncus, "but we've both been lucky." Doris couldn't help looking at his crooked back, and his deformed left arm, and his right stump. "Ah, yes," he said, "but you mustn't judge by those. That's the very mistake that I made. You see, I once fell down a staircase myself, 2 or 3 years after staircases were invented." He looked at Doris and nodded his head. "It was when I was a small boy," he said, "as small as your little brother, and that's why I grew up crooked and deformed. I was very unhappy about it. It was thousands of years ago, but I can still remember how unhappy I was. I used to watch the other children playing games, and when I grew up I watched the men go hunting, and I had to stay at home. And the women despised me, and at last I died, and then I saw how silly I had been." "Why had you been silly?" asked Doris. "Well, I'd wasted the whole of my life, you see, thinking about the staircase and how miserable I was, and so when the good Lord God asked me what I wanted to do next, there was hardly anything that I could turn my hand to. But I told you I was lucky, and so I was, for as it happened I had a great idea, and that was to try and save as many children as I could from being as miserable as I had been. Of course I couldn't expect much of a job, seeing how I've thrown away all my chances, so I asked the good Lord God if he would allow me to look after the world's staircases." He disappeared again. "Been to Port Jacobson," he said. "Well, the good Lord God thought that it was a rather fine idea, and so he laid his hand upon me and gave me a new name, and my new name was St. Uncus." "Shall I have a new name, too?" asked Doris. St. Uncus beamed. "Why, of course," he said. "Everybody has a new name, only it generally depends, to a certain extent, upon what they did with their old ones." Doris thought for a moment. "But wouldn't you rather be in heaven," she said, "than sitting about on these silly old staircases?" St. Uncus laughed. "But heaven's not a place, my dear. Heaven's being employed by the good Lord God." Then he looked at his watch. "And now I wonder," he said, "if you'd mind doing me a good turn." "Oh, I should love to," said Doris, "but how can I?" "Well, you see," he said, "the worst part of my job is that I can never get a chance of seeing my brother Bill. He's always busy by the edges of ponds and things, and I'm always stuck on somebody's staircase, and I thought perhaps if you wouldn't mind taking my hook for a bit I could slip off for a moment and have a talk with him." Doris felt a little shy. "But should I be able to use it?" she asked. "And how could I tell whether somebody wanted me?" "Oh, that'll be all right," he said, "as soon as you catch hold of the hook. And perhaps you won't be wanted at all. The only trouble is when two children are falling at once, and then you have to decide which you'll go for. But that doesn't happen very often, considering how many children there are." So Doris went upstairs, and he unbuttoned the hook, and when she caught hold of it she felt a strange sort of thrill. She felt like Cuthbert had felt when he went into In-Between Land, and indeed that was where she really was. St. Uncus had vanished, and she saw Christopher Mark like a little fat ghost, with his soul shining inside him. Then she suddenly heard a cry in a strange foreign language, and she saw a dark-eyed mother at the bottom of some stone steps, and a small round baby with an olive-colored skin tumbling down them one by one. She felt a hot wind, full of the odor of spices, blowing faintly against her cheek, and then she bent forward and hooked up the baby, and saw the look of terror die out of the mother's face. Never in her life had Doris felt so pleased. She felt as if she could shout and sing with joy. No wonder, she thought, that St. Uncus looked so happy. She began to understand what being in heaven meant, and then she heard a shout, and smelt a smell of herrings, and saw a man in a blue jersey and a curly brown-headed boy about 4 years old, pitching head-first down a dark staircase. Through a dirty window-pane she could see the mouth of a river, full of fishing smacks floating side by side, and she saw a woman with rolled-up sleeves run out of a kitchen and stand beside the man. Then she hooked up the boy, and she heard the woman say, "Thank God!" and the man say, "You little rascal, you!" And then she was back again, and there was St. Uncus sitting beside her and rubbing his hands. "Ever so many thanks," he said. "I haven't seen old Bill for nearly 300 years. He says he'd like to meet you, but of course it's only now and again that anybody like you is able to see us." Then he said good-bye to her, and she never saw him again, but she knew that he was there, and once she actually heard him, and that was very late on this same evening, long after everyone had gone to bed. For soon after midnight, when Auntie Kate was dreaming about clergymen and bazaars, and when Teddy and George were dreaming about bears, and Jimmy and Jocko about bathrooms, and when Christopher Mark was dreaming about rabbits, and Doris wasn't dreaming at all, soon after midnight a little red-hot cinder suddenly popped out of the kitchen grate. It fell on a bit of matting and burnt its way through to the floorboards below, and presently a wisp of smoke, with a wicked pungent smell, began to twist upward and flatten against the ceiling. Fuller and fuller grew the kitchen of smoke, and Teddy and George began to dream of campfires, but Auntie Kate still dreamt of bazaars and pincushions marked 10 pence halfpenny. Teddy and George were sleeping by themselves, and Christopher Mark slept in a little room turning out of Auntie Kate's. These rooms were above the sitting-room in the front of the house, and it was Teddy and George who slept over the kitchen, while Doris herself and Jimmy and Jocko shared a little room under the roof. The floor of the kitchen was now blazing fiercely, with the boards crackling in the flames, and Teddy and George began to dream about guns, but still they didn't wake up. They only moved a little uneasily, and it was somebody shouting that finally woke them, just as it was a neighbor banging at the front door that roused Auntie Kate from her dreams. "Hurry up!" cried the neighbor. "Your house is on fire!" And Auntie Kate was so flustered that she quite forgot where she had put her clothes, and rushed downstairs in her nightdress. As for Teddy and George, their room was full of smoke, and they bolted out of it coughing and spluttering, and met Doris coming down from the attic, pushing Jimmy and Jocko in front of her. The kitchen door had now swung open, and the flames were darting across the hall, and clouds of smoke were rolling upstairs like a sour and suffocating fog. "Never mind," said Doris. "Hold your breath and run downstairs as quick as you can." And soon they were all standing together in the street, while some of the neighbors were running for the fire engine. It had stopped raining, but the pavement felt all cold and clammy as they stood upon it with their bare feet, and it seemed funny to be out in the dark with nothing on but their nightgowns. Auntie Kay had fled into an opposite house because she couldn't bear that so many people should see her, but Teddy and George were rather enjoying themselves, though Jimmy and Jocko had begun to cry. Then Doris looked around. "Where's Christopher Mark?" she cried, and everybody looked at everybody else, and Doris knew that he must be still asleep in his little dressing-room upstairs. She rushed into the house, but the leaping flames had already begun to curl round the banisters, and the lady next door caught hold of her arm and told her that it would be madness to try and rescue him, but Doris shook her off and ran across the hall and dashed blindly up the burning staircase. "Oh, St. Uncus," she said, "come and help me! Come and help me save Christopher Mark!" The sound of the flames was like the roar of an engine, and the smoke was thicker than the blackest night. But at the top of the stairs she suddenly heard a whisper, "It's all right, my dear, I'm here." And then she laughed, and found Christopher Mark fast asleep, hugging his white rabbit, and in another few seconds she was out in the street again, with Christopher Mark safe in her arms. Some of the people cheered her and patted her on the back, and began to tell her how brave she had been, and she was rather pleased, of course, especially when she thought of Mummy, who would be sure to hear about it in hospital. But she wasn't conceited, because she knew that she had been helped by a little saint with a crooked back, who served God by keeping an eye on all the staircases in the world. Never a babe in Port of Spain, Peabody Buildings, Portland, Maine, Limerick, Lima, Boston, York, Nottingham, Naples, Cairo, Cork, Milton of Campsie, Moscow, Mull, Halifax, Hampstead, Hobart, Hull, never a baby climbs a stair, but little St. Hook is waiting there. End of chapter 9. Of Half Past Bedtime by H. Bashford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Old Mother Hubbard. Cuthbert was very sorry when he heard about the fire at Doris's house, and when he next saw her in the street he almost crossed the road to speak to her, but she hadn't spoken to him for so long that he had resolved not to talk to her unless she spoke to him first. Doris and Jimmy and Jocko were now staying with some people called Brown, and Doris's mother and the twins and Christopher Mark were staying with Gwendolen's aunt and Captain Jeremy. It was rather fun staying with the Browns, but on the whole Doris was rather sad because it would be 2 months, so the builder said, before they could all be at home together again. Cuthbert knew about this because Marian had told him, and that was why he nearly crossed the road, but he decided not to, and he didn't see Doris again until the 2nd day of the holidays. That was the Thursday before Christmas, and it was a gray day and very cold, with a strong wind blowing out of the northeast, and all the houses looked huddled and shrunken. It was early in the afternoon, and he had just been to call for Edward, but Edward had gone out to sit by the railway. He was collecting the numbers on engines, and had already got 37. Cuthbert was collecting too, but he was collecting the dates on pennies, so he didn't feel inclined to go and sit with Edward, and it was just as he was wondering what to do that he saw Doris turn the corner. For a moment he thought that he would pretend not to see her, but she was all alone, and it suddenly occurred to him that it would be rather a good idea to take her out to tea at Uncle Joe's. So he stopped and asked her, and she was very glad, because she had nothing particular to do, and she told him all about St. Uncus and the fire, and what it was like being nearly burnt to death. "Let's cut across the fields," she said, "past old Mother Hubbard's. It's jolly cold. I think it's going to snow." "I hope it is," said Cuthbert, "but it's not so cold as the day on which we found the iceman." But it was quite cold enough, with the horses in the fields standing dismally under the naked hedges, and the black northeaster crumbling the ridges of the plough lands until they looked like pale-colored powdered chocolate. "I shall be jolly glad," said Cuthbert, "when we get to Uncle Joe's." And just then they passed Mother Hubbard's, a melancholy house standing by itself, with all its blinds and curtains drawn. It was always like that, and behind it were some ruined stables with a tin roof that flapped up and down, and a big yellow dog on a long chain ran out and yelped at them as they passed. This was called Mother Hubbard's house because it belonged to a Miss Hubbard, who lived there all by herself, and who had allowed nobody to enter the door since her father had died 50 years ago. He had been a proud old general with a bad temper, and some people said that he had driven Miss Hubbard mad, but other people said that she was only queer and hated everybody except her dog. Occasionally she could be seen peering round one of the blinds, or feeding her dog in the ruined stables, and once a week she went into the town with a big bag to do her shopping. The shop people said that she was very polite, and so did the postman, who sometimes took her a letter, but she always kept her own counsel, and nobody could ever make her talk. Why she lived like that nobody knew. Some people said that it was because she was so poor, and because her father had made her promise never to let people know how poor she was. But other people said that she was really rather rich, and that she must have had some great trouble. She was very old, nearly 80, although her eyes were clear and so were her cheeks, but there were still a few people who remembered her as a girl galloping on horseback over the fields. "Silly old thing," said Doris as they left her house behind them. "I shouldn't be surprised if she was a witch." But Cuthbert said that there weren't any such things, and perhaps she had killed somebody and had a guilty conscience. Then they crossed a road and climbed over a stile, and skirted a great field pricked with tiny wheat blades, and then they slipped down a rather steep bank into a sheltered lane still wet with mud. They had already forgotten old Mother Hubbard, and the next moment they forgot her still more, for just then came clattering down the lane a young man on horseback, splashed to his eyes. His bowler hat was crammed down on his head, and he shouted at them as he galloped by. "Which way have they gone?" he cried. But he never stopped for an answer, and soon there came some more riders, both men and women. They had evidently come down the lane to avoid a big plowed field that lay between the high hedges on the other side of it, for Cuthbert and Doris presently saw them turn sharply to the right into a grass meadow where it was easier to gallop. "It's the hunt," said Doris. "Let's run after them." So they turned and ran down the lane, and saw the riders, one by one, jumping over a gate on the far side of the meadow. Then they crossed the meadow and scrambled over the gate just in time to see the last of the horsemen disappearing over another hedge a couple of 100 yards away. "We shall never catch them," said Cuthbert, but just then they heard a horn blowing. "It's the fox!" cried Doris. "They've seen the fox!" And half a minute later, from a little rise in the ground, they saw the whole hunt streaming away from them. They were so hot now that they had forgotten all about the wind and the great clouds gathering over the downs, and their only thought was to be up among the horses and their jolly red-cheeked riders. So they ran down the rise and across another road and over some more fields and past a wood, until they came at last to a stream running rather sluggishly between some pollarded willows. On one of these there was a man standing, and he waved his hand to them as they came up. "They're coming back," he said. "Keep along the stream, and I'll lay $1 you'll see some fun." It was now nearly 4, and the light was beginning to fade, and they were ever so far from Uncle Joe's. But they pushed their way through the tangled grass until they came to a plank across the stream. This led them out beside a hazel copse, and just as they were wondering which way to go, they heard the horn again, not very far away, and the clear, deep calling of the hounds. Something cold fell on Cuthbert's cheek. "Hullo," he said, "it's beginning to snow." And then a burly man on a big gray mare came crashing through the undergrowth on the other side of the stream. He gave a shout, and they jumped aside as his horse rose to clear the water, but the next moment he was sprawling on the ground in front of them, with his scarlet coat about his ears. They heard him swear, but as he picked himself up and helped his horse out of the stream he began to laugh, and soon he was in the saddle again and vanishing into the dusk. For a minute or two they waited, but nobody else came. An old cock pheasant rattled out of the hazel copse, the horn blew once more, and then all was still. Their breath stood like smoke upon the air. Then Doris suddenly stooped and picked up a coin that had been half trampled into the bank. "Hullo," she said, "he's dropped a penny. You'd better add the date of it to your collection." Cuthbert took it from her, but the penny was an old one, and the date was difficult to see. The snow began to fall upon them in heavy flakes. Cuthbert took out his handkerchief and polished the coin. And then an odd thing happened, for suddenly, as he polished, The stream and the hazel copse seemed to fade away, and it was another girl, a grown-up girl, who had just given him the penny. "A penny for your thoughts," she said, and Cuthbert knew that she wasn't speaking to him, but to somebody else, and the thoughts that came into his head weren't his own, but a grown-up man's. He knew that they were somebody else's thoughts, because he was thinking his own thoughts too, and the other person's thoughts were of two kinds: the weak thoughts that he decided to tell the girl, and the strong thoughts that went into the penny. The thoughts that he told the girl were that when he got to South America he was going to spend his spare time studying the birds there. He was going to write a book about them, and perhaps, when he had written his book, he would get a job looking after a museum. But his strong thoughts that he didn't tell her were: "I love you and want to marry you, but I mustn't tell you that, because I'm only a carpenter and you're a lady, ever so far above me." "What's the matter?" said Doris. Cuthbert gave her the penny. "It's a queer sort of penny," he said. "Catch hold of it." Doris took it. "I don't see anything queer in it," she said. So Cuthbert polished it once more. This time he polished it harder, so that when he gave it to Doris again it was quite warm from the polishing, and Doris seemed to be standing in a strange sort of room, full of old-fashioned furniture and heavy ornaments. The same girl said, "A penny for your thoughts," and the same thoughts came to her as had come to Cuthbert. The day drew in. It was almost dark now, and the snow was glistening on their shoulders. "I know what's happened," she said. "His real thoughts were so strong that they all went into the penny." Cuthbert nodded. "That's what I thought," he said, "and when you rub the penny they all come out." "Did you notice the girl's dress?" asked Doris, "and the way her hair was done, and the blue china dog on the mantelpiece?" Cuthbert shook his head. "Let's have another go," he said, and he rubbed the penny again as hard as he could. This time he noticed the room, with its queer high-backed piano, and a picture of people hunting hanging on the wall, and the blue china dog, and the girl's dress, and the curious way in which she had done her hair. It was pulled back from her forehead into a smooth sort of bundle behind her head, and her dress was all in terraces, like a wedding cake, or a theater turned upside down. "It must have been a good long time," said Cuthbert, "since she gave him the penny. Do you think he was the man who fell off the horse?" "Oh, he couldn't have been," said Doris. "He was much too young, and besides, I'm sure that he was never a carpenter." She shivered a little. "We ought to be getting home," she said, but Cuthbert lingered for a moment, looking at the penny. "I expect hundreds of people," he said, "have had it in their pockets and never known what was inside it." "I dare say," said Doris, "but I know I'm jolly hungry, and we must be miles away from anywhere." Nor were they quite sure where anywhere was, but they crossed the plank again and started for home, with the snow driving past their ears and piling up in front of their feet. Gray-capped hedges loomed up before them, rising unexpectedly out of the darkness, and so thick lay the snow that they were never able to tell whether the next field was a plowed one. But they passed the tree, or they thought that they did, on which the man had been standing, and they crossed the road, or they thought that they did, that they had crossed after running down the rise. But the hours went by, and they felt emptier and emptier, and several times they stumbled into snow-filled ditches, and the snow roared past them in angry whiteness, and melted upon their necks, and trickled down their backs. Longingly they thought then of Uncle Joe's, and of plates of hot muffins before the fire, and even more longingly of supper at home, with bowls of steaming bread and milk. But every field seemed endlesser than the last, and the snow grew deeper and ever more deep, and the night closed down upon them like a lid, and their feet felt heavier than 10-pound weights. "I believe we're lost," said Cuthbert, but Doris didn't seem to hear. So they toiled on with sinking hearts, and then at last, just as they were almost spent, they suddenly knocked their knees against a little gate. It was a sort of gate that leads into a garden path, and though they could see no sign of this, or even of a light, they pushed it open with a great effort, and went plunging into the snow beyond. Sometimes people have been frozen close to a house, But in a little while they saw a great dark shadow, and then, to their joy, they found themselves in front of a door, with a gleam of light shining through the letter box. For a long time they knocked, but nobody came, and several times they shouted through the letter box, but still nobody came. And then from behind the house they heard the barking of a dog. Doris gripped Cuthbert's arm. "It's old Mother Hubbard's," she said. "That's her dog. I know its bark." "Then we'll never get in," said Cuthbert. But just as he said that they heard footsteps coming down the hall. "Who's there?" said a voice. It had an odd sort of creak in it, like the creak of a drawer that is seldom opened. Cuthbert told her, and then, after a long pause, the door moved a little on its hinges. An eddy of snow whirled in front of them, and the door swung back an inch or two more. "You'd better come inside," said Miss Hubbard, and they went into the hall, her first guests for 50 years. She stood looking at them over a flickering candle. Her eyes were frostier than the wind outside. The air of the house smelt like a tomb. They could hear the ticking of several clocks. "You'd better come into the scullery," she said, "and shake the snow off." And she led them in silence to the back of the house, where she left them alone for nearly 20 minutes before she came back to ask them in to tea. "It's in the drawing-room," she said, "and I hope you won't talk. I'm very strong, and I have a big dog." So they followed her into the drawing-room, and then a second and even more wonderful thing happened. Cuthbert stopped short, and so did Doris, and old Miss Hubbard switched round and stared at them. "What's the matter?" she asked. "What are you gaping at?" "Why, it's the penny room," said Cuthbert, and so it was, for there was the queer high-backed piano, and there was the picture of people hunting, and there were the old-fashioned heavy ornaments. "But where's the dog?" said Doris. "The blue china dog that used to stand on the mantelpiece." Old Miss Hubbard had turned quite white. "The blue china dog?" she asked. "What do you know about that? It was broken 30 years ago." "But it's the same room," said Cuthbert, "and there was a girl in it, and she gave a man a penny for his thoughts." Old Miss Hubbard began to tremble. She sat down heavily, and her eyes looked frightened. "But how do you know?" she asked. "You're only children, and that was more than 50 years ago." Cuthbert felt in his pocket and pulled out the penny. "This is the penny," he said, "that the girl gave him. We've just found it, quite by accident, and he didn't tell her all of his thoughts. He told her only some of them. The rest are in here, and we made them come out." He began to polish it again with his handkerchief, and then he gave it to her, and they stood watching her. For about 5 minutes she sat quite still, and then she looked up, and her voice had changed a little. "I'll tell you a story," she said. "Will you let me keep it?" Cuthbert looked at Doris, and Doris nodded her head. "Why, of course," said Cuthbert. "We should be very pleased." So while they were having tea she told them that long ago a girl had lived in that house, and that she fell in love with a young man who was a carpenter by trade, but he was also a naturalist and especially fond of birds, and he wanted to discover all sorts of things about them. And one day he told the girl that he was just going away to work on a railway in South America. Then he hesitated, as if he wanted to tell her something else, and she gave him a penny for his thoughts, and then he left the house, and was drowned at sea, and the girl never knew whether he had loved her or not. "It was very silly of him," said Miss Hubbard, "not to have told her, but perhaps the girl was sillier still, for she was so sad that she wasted her whole life, and now it seemed that he loved her after all." Then she went to the window and pulled up the blind. The storm had died down, and it had stopped snowing. Brighter than eyes at a Christmas party, the stars in their thousands shone in the sky. Cuthbert and Doris said that they must be going, and old Miss Hubbard took them to the front door. "You must come and see me again," she said. "Come as often as you like, and perhaps next time you'll bring some of your friends." "But she never told us," said Cuthbert, "who the girl was." "Why, you silly," said Doris, "it was Miss Hubbard herself." Old Mother Hubbard went to the cupboard to fetch her poor dog a bone. But this Mother Hubbard in her heart's cupboard lives in the dark alone. Sorrow's gray dust on the chandelier never a sunray sees, never a finger stirs the blind, nor the harpsichord's yellow keys. Dumb is the clock with the china face, the carpet molds on the floor. Oh, won't you come down to her house with me and open Miss Hubbard's door? End of chapter 10.